So the next day, the judge resumes their summary. The judge says to the jury that she was clarifying a point of evidence before continuing her summing up. The judge says we haven't got an enormous amount to go this morning, so I will conclude my summing up this morning. The judge reminds the jury of the timings around the shooting. The judge says the Liverpool vs Manchester United match finished at 9:52 p.m. Joseph Nee and Mr. Abraham were then seen on CCTV walking in the street at 9:59 p.m. The first 999 call reporting gunshots was made at 10 p.m. The gunman was then seen running away on Finch Lane at 10:02 p.m. It is agreed that Cashman then travelled as a passenger in Paul Russell's car and was dropped on Asbest Road at 10:47 p.m. He is later seen being driven by Paul McCarthy at 11:18 p.m. The judge says the defendant said he was in Mr. Bryan's van in the footage at 9:16 p.m. This is a disputed point that is not the prosecution case. The defendant says he was travelling to Snowbury Road. His evidence is that he and Mr. Bryan were going to count the drug money. He then had a spliff, went into the front garden and were chatting. The defendant said he saw Nicky McHale and was speaking to him across the road. Craig then came down and asked if Mr. McHale would take him somewhere. Mr. Cashman sat on the wall smoking and Mr. Russell came along in the car. The judge then turns to Nicholas McHale's evidence. Mr. McHale was called in to give an alibi, in that he saw the defendant on Snowbury Road at the time. If his evidence is true and accurate to timings, the defendant cannot have been the gunman. If you were to conclude that may be the case, you would find him not guilty. If you were to conclude that on the timings, the evidence of Mr. McHale cannot be accurate, you shouldn't jump immediately to reject the alibi. You should conduct a critical analysis of the discrepancies. If you conclude Mr. McHale's evidence may be right, you would have to acquit the defendant. If you conclude the alibi is false, you may take that into account, but you would still need to take into account all the other evidence. The evaluation of this evidence is entirely a matter for you. The judge then turns to Mr. McCarthy's evidence. The judge says, the defendant did not challenge it. Counsel made inferences to what you could draw from that evidence. You must bear in mind Mr. McCarthy's evidence is agreed and unchallenged. Mr. Cooper suggested Mr. McLaren was confusing the evidence picture. She says Mr. McHale's evidence should be weighed against this. Mr. McCarthy said earlier that day he'd driven Nicky McHale to Alderley Edge to meet a girl. He said he watched a football with Mr. McHale that evening. 5 to 10 minutes after the match ended, Craig Bryan knocked on the door carrying a khaki-coloured rucksack. He drove Craig to a block of flats on Blackmore Drive and came out without the bag. Mr. McCarthy reported that there were police everywhere on their way back. When they got to Snowbury Road, Craig stayed for 5 to 10 minutes before he left. A short time after, Nicky was outside having a smoke. When he came back in, Nicky was with a mate. They went to the kitchen where they were rolling a spliff and talking. A short time later, Nicky came out and asked him to give his mate a lift, which he did. They left immediately. He was directed to Mab Lane. It was an awkward journey as he didn't speak other than directions. Mr. McCarthy thought it was strange to give him a lift when it was such a short distance. He saw a picture of Cashman after he was arrested and realised he was Nicky's mate. Returning back to Mr. McHale's evidence, the judge says, Nicky McHale said he was stood outside his house at around 9:50 p.m. and saw Mr. Bryan and Cashman. He was speaking to Cashman, who was laughing at him for being stressed by the football. He went inside to watch the pundits after the game. When he looked out, Cashman had gone back inside. About 5 to 10 minutes later, Craig Bryan asked him if he would drop off some cash. He asked Mr. McCarthy, who agreed to take him. When Paul returned, he commented on there being a lot of police presence. Mr. Bryan came back for a few seconds, then went to his own house. About 20 to 30 minutes later, Thomas Cashman came over. Mr. McHale then went back to the shop to buy cans of drink, driving in Cashman's van. The defendant asked for a lift home. He said he didn't want to drive because of the police presence and he had been smoking cannabis. Mr. McHale said he didn't want to drive as he also had no licence, but asked Paul McCarthy to take him. He said he had been exchanging messages with the defendant's niece, Bobby Bailey, and he said it was just flirty banter as he'd always fancied her. The judge says, after this, Cashman said he left his sister's house on a bicycle. Cashman took a shortcut by Playfield Walk and saw his niece Bobby Bailey sitting in the window of her home. Her Ford Fiesta car was then seen heading to Grenadier Drive. It arrived at approximately 10 to 12, which is midnight. The judge says someone got out of the vehicle. The timeline states it is believed that Mason Hill gets out of the vehicle. The defendant said he was the passenger and Bobby Bailey had dropped him home at that time. After midnight, the black Ford Fiesta returns to Grenadier Drive. The vehicle then goes back from the way it came. The defendant told you when he got home he had an argument with Kaylee, so he decided to go to a flat he has access to in the same blocks as Bobby Bailey to chill and get his head down. The judge then turns to Cashman's movements on Tuesday, August 23rd, the day after the shooting. This includes Cashman visiting his sister's home on Mab Lane in the afternoon. The judge says, the defendant said his movements were normal. He was keeping a low profile. Cashman was later seen outside the home of the witness who cannot be named for legal reasons. The judge said the defendant's explanation was he had seen Paul Russell. Russell was earlier said to have passed on associate of his, Craig Bryan, a quantity of poor quality cannabis and some cash in partial payment for the £25,000 drug debt. The judge said, he said, what the fuck's that you brought round, that's a load of shit. He said he'd take his graph phone and car. Cashman and his partner, Kaylee Ann Sweeney, arrived at the decks in Runcorn shortly after 11 p.m. on August 24th, then went to Asda. It is on CCTV from that night we see the defendant in a blue t-shirt, the Monteranian tracksuit and the trainers. He said this was somewhere he and Kaylee would go for some chill-out time. The following day, now August 25th, Thomas Cashman and Kaylee Ann Sweeney leave the decks at 10:15 p.m. and head towards Merseyside. That afternoon, the evidence is that the CCTV recorder at the defendant's home was disconnected. The defendant accepts he removed the router from Grenadier Drive. He said he did that because Nicky McHale's house, his stash house for drugs, had been raided. He was being a little paranoid as the CCTV would see him going back and forth. He said he took the recorder to a mate's who he wouldn't name and he doesn't know where it is now. Thomas Cashman and Miss Sweeney left the deck shortly after 2 p.m. on August the 26th, heading in the direction of Merseyside. Later on, Thomas Cashman was seen exiting his sister's home on Mab Lane. He was carrying a bag, and this was on August the 28th. On September the 1st, he bought a mobile phone at a Tesco supermarket in Burscough. The judge reminds the jury that the defendant previously said he would not buy a mobile phone from a supermarket. He said it was different. He was grafting then, and it wasn't a graft phone. He just needed a phone to keep in contact. Cashman then goes to the decks with John Wynne. He was arrested on September the 4th and interviewed before being released on bail after 2 days, then being rearrested on September the 29th. The judge goes on to say, "It is entirely up to you how you organise your discussions. You may find it helpful to find a juror to chair your discussions." The judge explains this is referred to as a foreman. She says the foreman must ensure that each member of the jury express their views and that no one is pressured into reacting a particular verdict by others. The judge is quoted in saying, "When you have reached your verdict, you will all come back into court to deliver them. It is important you try and reach verdicts which are unanimous, verdicts on which all of you agree. As you may know, the law permits me, in certain circumstances, to permit a verdict which is not agreed by you all. Should the time ever come where it is possible, I will give you a further direction in relation to that." So this now concludes the total summary of the judge's evidence.